Welcome to Module 7, where we're going to be talking about bad debt. Bad debt is basically the expense we incur when our customers don't pay us. So if you remember back to Modules 2 and 3, we were talking about accounts receivable. That was one of the accounts we used, and that was the asset that we booked when we sold something to a customer on account. And they gave us a promise to pay, maybe in 30 days or 60 days. And until they paid us, we had this accounts receivable, which was the amount due from our customer. Okay, most of your customers are gonna pay, but occasionally someone might not pay, usually because there's some sort of financial issue. How do you know when someone's not gonna pay you? Generally, you're not going to call up and say, hey, customer, you owe me money, and they say, you know what, I'm not paying. Sorry. It would actually make things easier if people were honest like that. You might get a notice in a newspaper or online that the customer's filed bankruptcy. That's usually a good indication that you're not going to get paid. But let me tell you a story about one of the startup companies I worked for. I was the assistant controller, and we ran out of money. And so we stopped paying our bills. So this is an example of what it could look like that would give you an indication that your customer's not going to pay. The vendor, they'd send us an invoice and I wouldn't pay it. And they'd call and they would say, hey, you owe us money. And the first thing I did is I said, oh, I never got the invoice. Maybe it was sitting right there on my desk, but this is the game you play. And they go, no problem, we'll send it to you. So they'd send me over the invoice and they'd fax it to me or email it to me. And then they'd call me back a couple days later and say, hey, did you get the invoice? And I'd say, yes, I did. And they would say, okay, so you're gonna pay us? And I'd say, you know what? I need to get approval from my manager or from the person who purchased the goods or services or from the CFO. But they're on vacation. So they'll be back in 2 weeks and I'll get their approval and I'll pay you. And they'd say, okay. And they call me back in 2 weeks and say, okay, is your person back from vacation? And then I'd have to make up some other kind of excuse. Yeah, but the person who runs the checks, they're out sick. And eventually I just stopped answering my phone. And by that point, they usually had a pretty good idea that my company wasn't going to pay them. Okay, so those are some of the ways that you can tell that maybe someone's not going to pay you. But anyway, so we're gonna be talking about bad debt. One other thing I just wanted to introduce you to before we get into the module is when we record our bad debt, we're going to debit bad debt expense, and we're going to credit something called allowance for doubtful accounts. Now, if you remember in Module 4 when we did book depreciation, our credit was to something called accumulated depreciation, and who remembers what kind of account that was? That's right, it was a Contra asset account. And that means that it sits with the assets, but it has a natural credit balance. Okay, so it's an asset account, but it has a natural credit balance, and that's why we call it a contra asset. It goes against the regular natural balance of assets. And this one is going to sit right below accounts receivable. So if we want to see how much money do we actually think we're going to get, how much cash, we would take our accounts receivable and we would subtract our allowance for doubtful accounts, and that would let us know how much cash do we really expect to receive. Okay, so that's your overview of bad debt, and now let's get into the nitty-gritty. All right, see you guys there.